and I may have gone there too. So I decided when I finished high school that everybody in my family had gone to UT. My father had taught at UT, my grandfather taught at UT, and I decided, well, I'm just going to go somewhere else. So I went to the University of Michigan because I had heard wonderful things about the science there. And at that time, I was evenly split between shall I be in the arts or shall I be in the sciences, and I knew I had a big decision to make, but I couldn't make it then. So I went to Michigan to make my decision, and I encountered for the first time the whole concept and existence of a subdiscipline called anthropology, and it solved all my problems. Arts and sciences together, perfect. So I ended up graduating with a joint degree in English and anthropology, which turned out to be the perfect combination of what I really, really wanted to do. Because English, starting in high school, I began to realize that what I really cared about in the study of literature was the way that it could create communities of agreement among people who had had the same experiences because they had read the same literature. And then when I started thinking more deeply about it, I realized, well, written literature has only been around for, a very small fraction of the top of the whole column of time. And so you've got all this sand all the way down that where people were speaking orally. They had oral literature only. And literature is really a misnomer. It was oral folklore, oral storytelling. So I decided that what I needed to do to really understand the roots of literature and its important social functions was to become an anthropologist, but focus on the oral literature of a group of people who were still exclusively oral. So I looked for a university that would have an interdisciplinary focus on the study of anthropology, and I found that Harvard had a so-called ad hoc PhD program, and that program allowed me to span across several different disciplines. So I had anthropology, psychology, and comparative literature, which at that time would cover oral literature. It was the perfect combination for me. So after I got to Harvard, I met fellow students who had similar interests, and I found out that I actually had an interdisciplinary program with a group of Klick speaking people in Africa who were hunters and gatherers and who did not have a written form of their literature. And I said, this is for me. This is where I'm going to do my field work. And I started bending all my efforts to getting accepted into their fieldwork program. And after many adventures in offices of professors who were very hard to convince, I know this lady has some similar experiences, I managed to get accepted in for a grant with this group called the Harvard Kalahari Research Group, and they sent me to Botswana for 18 months for my very first field work. And I just knew when I got on that freighter in New Orleans and sailed to Cape Town and then got on a train, Rhodesia Railways, and ended up in Mound, Botswana, that I was embarked on the great intellectual adventure of my life, and it certainly turned out to be true.
Did you go with a group?
No, I was on my own, and I went to join two other graduate students who were actually still there at the time, but they were finishing up their work within a couple of months. And after that, I was going to be on my own. I was the only graduate student who was unmarried at the time, and so all of the graduate students who had been there before had their spouses with them, but I was the only one who didn't have anybody to talk English to. So that was a very quick way of learning the Klick language, because
Can we ask questions?
yes, sure.
What year was this?
It was 1970.
How old were you then?
I was 25.
Wow.
Yeah.
And women were welcomed without question in these kind of things.
I'm they-
kidding.
Women were not necessarily welcomed by Harvard on these kinds of things, but the people I went to live with were incredibly welcoming, being a very egalitarian society, gender egalitarian, age egalitarian. I have never felt so welcomed by any group in my whole life, including my own family, I have to say. So I really lucked into a wonderful, wonderful experience where I had the chance to spend all day, every day for 18 months with a group of people who had welcomed me, who were excited about teaching me the language, and moreover, were very excited about teaching me about their culture. They knew that they had something special. And that's the story of the intellectual adventure, how I came to understand their healing dance that is quite unique in the world as one of the great intellectual discoveries and creations of humankind. It's a very, very ancient thing. Depictions of it appear in the rock art of Southern Africa. And all of the folklore of the people that I was gathering is permeated with the ideas of this healing dance. So I'm just going to start off, so I kind of in the middle of things and read you my introduction story of what happened soon after I arrived. I was the two students that I was joining were Marjorie Showstock and Mel Connor, who went on to write, fabulous classic books in anthropology that have been used by generations of students. But anyway, they were a couple of years older than I, and I came to see them as my best teachers over there in the 2 months that I had with them speaking English. This is something that happened just about a month after I had arrived. Marjorie and I sat in the dark on cold sand beside the flooded Moapo, our chins on our chests in despair. In the middle of the black water we tried to ford. We could see Mel on the front seat of the drowned Land Rover, reading the Merck manual by torchlight. In the luggage section behind him, 2 dogs howled from the crates in which they were imprisoned. The previous afternoon, we had discovered our beloved camp dogs foaming at the mouth. We had been treating them for what we thought was biliary, which is a mild canine distemper, inserting by hand into their throats big tablets given to us by the traveling vet. But the foaming, which was new, terrified us with the possibility of rabies. There's a lot of rabies in that area. We crated the dogs, we packed our supplies and clothes, and we headed for the nearest town. There, the dogs could be tested, and we could find a hospital or clinic for ourselves. Problems. The nearest town of any size was Maun, Botswana, some 250 kilometers away. The astonishing rainy season of 1970 to 71 turned the western fringes of the Kalahari Desert into a series of swollen molapos, rivers running between transverse dunes in a heavy sand landscape that covered at least 200 of those kilometers. And the only road between our camp at Dobie and the town of Maun was a deep and twisting sandy track, difficult to navigate at the driest of times, but treacherous with sandy and muddy potholes from December to March, the only time rain falls at all in the Kalahari. It was then February 1971. Only a few kilometers east of Dobie, we'd spend 14 hours digging ourselves out of our first mud hole by lantern light, our first night on the road. Now, only a few more kilometers east of that first mud hole, we were into our second night. Water had been sucked into our tailpipe when we tried to cross a section of Malapo deeper than we thought it was, and our exhaustion and fear were such that all we could do was sit and worry whether poking pills past our dog's teeth might have exposed us to rabies. Other than the dog's intermittent howling, we were surrounded by the utter silence of the Kalahari. It was then, sitting on the sandy bank with her legs caked in the dried mud of the first mud hole, that Marjorie began to have symptoms. She would reach out her arm to pick up her hat or her notebook, and her arm would spasm, pulling backwards alarmingly. She was convinced she had contracted rabies and would die. Mel found in the Merck manual that if we indeed had been exposed, we had possibly 48 hours to start the rabies vaccine series, which is, or was at that time, 14 days of painful shots right into your stomach. And we were still more than 200 kilometers, most of them similarly flooded, from Maun. At that news, the tension that had been building between me and Marjorie for other reasons, among them that I was an overeager newcomer and she was ready to finish fieldwork and go home, overwhelmed us. All three of us stopped talking completely. I was in hell, I thought. I was 25 years old and had been in Africa just 50 of 550 days scheduled for my PhD fieldwork. I had no return ticket yet back to the US. I was going to be on my own without anyone to speak English to for most of the time. And the Zhuanghua language, erroneously called Kung at the time by scholars, was a basically unwritten one I would have to learn by immersion. I had had some oral lessons in Kung back in Massachusetts from another fellow graduate student, and I knew that it had 4 Klick consonants. Only later did I learn that combined with other consonants, the permutations of these 4 Klicks with other consonants yielded a total of 84 consonants, completely unknown in European languages.
Wow. Did the indigenous people speak English at all?
No,
Wow.
they spoke some other African languages, but I wasn't extending myself that far.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
When you planned this,
Were you
and this was a time, I know from Sue that single women were not encouraged to do these things. Did you have any fear when you came across or when you conceived of the idea of where you were gonna go?
You know, I thought I was immortal at that time. So, looking back on it, oh my God, did I really do that? Oh, what a terrible idea. But yeah, no, I apparently was fearless at that time.
Right.
Can you demonstrate the 4 simple clicks?
Sure. Ochamuklan, kake, kakake, clay, quinke, take tua ku, wa, I tua hoakwe, similkan. I basically said, I'm so glad we're all here today. It's been a long time since I've seen lots of you, and it's great to be together.
I could only make out. And it seemed very similar to the one in the Sutu languages.
Yeah, that one. Yeah, and the first one is, and then a very subtle one. And then the last one is like clucking to a horse.
The second one, I think I encountered in Cinderella. But, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, let me continue with the rabies story. Yeah. Do I need to speak louder?
No one said anything, so I assume they can hear you.
Okay. We had spent the 50 days and so we returned to Mound sooner than we had planned because of what we came to call the rabies run. Somehow
to get out. You left us in the middle. You can't suddenly be out without telling us how you got out.
Well, the water that had gotten into the exhaust pipe drained out during the night.
We were
very
overnight to stay
slowly.
there
Yes,
overnight.
yes, we sat on the bank and looked at the Land Rover all night, couldn't sleep. And the water drained out enough to get it started.
Wow.
This is a risk of Africa. I mean, I'm being caught in the middle, the height of a malaria attack, the same way, stuck in my car.
Oh,
with
and you had
water-
malaria at the time.
With water in the exhaust pipe,
Oh, ugh.
yeah.
But yours got out too?
Just stuck in this expanse of, rainy season water.
What about your friend, your colleague, not a friend, whose arm?
We're getting to her.
Oh, okay.
Yes, okay, that's Marjorie Showstuck. Somehow the water receded during our second sleepless night, and we got the Land Rover out of the Malapo at dawn. We could then see to avoid the deepest pits and could bush bash alternate routes around them. Our progress was agonizingly slow. At last we reached gravel. We drove at breakneck speed down the few kilometers of roadway leading into Mound, just as the 48-hour incubation time specified by Merck was ending. By this time, the dogs had gone quiet in the back. Were they dead already? Could their brain tissue still be analyzed for rabies if they were in fact dead? We were each racked by such questions, but we kept them to ourselves. I had already revised my definition of hell to include the inability to communicate in a critical situation with others. The fear of rabies was one thing, but not being able to talk about it was 100 times worse. We drove straight to the little hospital in Mound and around to the back entrance. Mel and Marjorie knew an expat doctor they thought would help us quickly. Providentially, he was standing in the yard when we screeched to a halt. We jumped out of the Land Rover and began rather hysterically to tell our story. The doctor rapidly arranged for the dogs to be killed and for their brains to be sent off to a lab in Lobatse near Gaborone for analysis. Then we watched him through a grimy clinic window as he rummaged in a small gas-powered refrigerator for rabies inoculation vials. At first, he could not find them. We stared through the window, thinking of the minutes ticking away, and we felt our hearts sink yet again. Here they are, he finally said, hauling them out from the back of the crowded, messy little refrigerator. We asked whether we had arrived in time for the inoculations to be effective. He said, if we had not yet begun to have symptoms, we would be fine if we started the shots right away. We lined up, and big needles were plunged into each of our diaphragms in turn. Painful as this was, I threw my hat in the air with relief that we had arrived in time. Then I turned to look at Marjorie, and she was glaring at me with a look that froze my bones. I'm already having symptoms, she choked out. You're celebrating for yourself, but you don't care if I die. These were the first words she had spoken to me in 2 days. I was horrified that she begrudged me relief about my life, but equally horrified that I had shown insensitivity to her fear. Having privately believed that her symptoms were psychosomatic and due to extreme stress, I had allowed myself an instant of celebration of my own imminent delivery from danger.
What kind of symptoms did she say she had?
She would reach out her arm and her arm would spasm. And probably she was dehydrated and freaked out and everything. And that's what I thought was the problem. But she thought it was the first symptoms. I remember that Mel was notably silent at this juncture. I assumed this meant either that he was showing absolute emotional support for his wife, or that he had been saddled with an impossible situation in a 3-person camp in which 2 women were at odds. Of course, in our fraught little crucible of a social situation, we had been unable to talk of any of this. We were the only English speakers effectively for hundreds of kilometers in any direction. Everything we might have discussed but couldn't hung over our heads in magnified, heavy, unavoidable form. I recall these events for a specific reason. The paralysis of our communication at that time foreshadowed many other poignant, painful, but productive learning experiences still to come in my life and work. I spent the next few grim days alone at Riley's Hotel on a bank of the Tamalakani River in Mound while we waited for the results on the dog's brains to come back. Mel and Marjorie stayed with their British friends, ornithologist Peter Jones and his wife Isla. Each day we trekked from opposite ends of Mound through heavy gray sand to the hospital for another painful shot each, deep into our stomach muscles. Each day, my allergy-like reaction to the shots seemed to grow worse. By the third day, I thought the shots would kill me before the rabies did. Finally, the lab report came back. It was biliary, distemper, not rabies, and we were all safe, except for the dogs, unfortunately.
Oh,
In a few days, we headed back to Dobie. Tentatively, Marjorie and I began speaking again, and we managed to get through our remaining weeks together in some dignity. In later years, there was a full, warm rapprochement between us. Marjorie published the first of 2 books that became anthropological classics, Nisa, The Life and Words of a Kong Woman. The rapprochement was, to her credit, initiated by Marjorie after she had been diagnosed with and knew she would likely die of breast cancer. Her Return to Nisa, the second book, was published posthumously, and like her first book, has been used in countless introductory anthropology courses. The rabies run was a huge and traumatic part of my introduction to fieldwork in Africa. It was the first of a long series of ill wind situations in my Kalahari life, each of which ended by blowing me some good. I believe it was the start, for instance, of my emergence from the cloud of romantic impulses that had gotten me to Botswana in the first place. What I now remember most about my first few months in the field was the enormous help Marjorie Shostak and Mel Connor gave me in shedding romantic impressionism and learning how to live and work well with the Junklasi. So that was the start of my 18 months of field work. And I'm happy to say that we all lived through that, and far from driving me from further work in the Kalahari, it was part of the cementing experience that I had in that first 18 months. So after the 18 months, I kept going back as many times as I could. I'm in the 50 years since then. I must have gone back 25 times or so, more, maybe more than that. And so when I sat down to write this memoir, I thought, okay, I'm going to write the story of 50 years of field work back and forth in the Kalahari. And I sat down to write it right at the start of the pandemic. I was alone in my house in Austin, and I figured now or never. And it transpired that I could only get through the first 18 months of the 50 years. So the rest of it has yet to be written. Oh dear, I don't think I'm going to do it, because this was this was the happiest thing that ever happened to me in my life. I put together so many of the experiences into a meaningful whole, something that meant a lot to me. You have a question?
Marion, who's on Zoom, asked the question, had you already learned some of the Kalahari language before the other speakers left?
Yes, I was working every day with a language teacher who spoke no English, but had been recommended by the grad students. Very sensitive man who was able to understand what I was asking, and he would answer me in Junkwasi, and so I learned that way. The other way that I learned was I started collecting folk tales almost as soon as I got there, even before I could understand them. And that turned out to be a marvelous way to learn vocabulary, because I learned the few basic plots very quickly, and then I could see how different storytellers were telling the stories differently according to their own interests and experiences. And so they were hanging different vocabulary on a scaffolding of a plot structure that I already understood. I realized that, this is really a lot of the way that children in oral culture learn their language. They don't go so quickly into, learning to read at age 5. They are listening to live performances, each one being a little bit different from the last, and learning language that way. So I was kind of a child in that culture. I had the inestimable challenge and also opportunity of having a kind of second socialization into a culture that was so very different from my own. And what an opportunity. I'm very, very thankful for it. However, it did not come without a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. But I have to say that the lessons that I learned from living with hunting and gathering people have stood me in good stead for my own personal life for now more than 50 years. And when you reflect on the fact that the ancestors of all of us, all over the world, were living very much as these hunting and gathering people were living, with social rules that kept their societies alive for eons longer than our historical societies have been alive on this earth, that there is something basically human about the adaptation that the hunter-gatherers had, that I wanted to learn about. Their social adaptation, their relationships with each other that kept their societies alive. And I realized that the key to that was in understanding their verbal culture. So I made a huge collection of the folk tales, even before I could understand every word. And I thought, oh, eventually I'll get all of these transcribed and translated. Well, more than 50 years later, I'm still working on that every day. And as I told Tom earlier today, yes, I'm retired, but I'm working harder than I ever have, because I'm trying to get all these translations done so they can go into open access archive.
May I ask a question about
Sure.
the stories?
Speak up,
people?
speak up.
Okay, were the stories, was there a person in the group that was a story rememberer or keeper, or did everyone tell the stories?
That is such a good question. When I first went there, I assumed that, there will be designated storytellers, old men and old women who know the best stories. And I was amazed to discover that just about everybody in the society, old and young, can tell these stories. There's a kind of deference paid to older people, because they've heard the stories longer than anybody and maybe gotten better at the telling. But young people knew those stories too. It was very exciting to discover that. And so I began to see differences in the styles that different storytellers would use. And I realized, it's very important not to just get one of each story. You better get as many variants as you possibly can.
Were the stories about life lessons or traditions, or what made them so important?
They are indirect. The main thing about them is they're incredibly entertaining adventure stories, weird stories of the old times about tricksters and animals who were people and people who were animals, all kinds of stories about phantasmagorical transformations, but each one with an indirect social lesson having to do with, look, if you do something really stupid like we have portrayed in this story, this is what's going to happen to you. But they were not didactic. And I think that was part of their power, that kids would just enjoy listening to the stories, and they would imbibe the lessons that way, rather than finding them something to rebel against.
What were your living conditions compared to theirs?
My living conditions there,
Compared to their,
well, mine were actually more primitive. I had a very small tent that blew down almost every night there was a wind.
Sorry.
Yeah, and they had stick houses with thatching grass over the top of them that were pretty good shelters. And I spent some nights in some of those houses, you know, when my tent blew down too many times. So, but I was really not far from the action. In the two camps that I lived in were between half a kilometer and 3 kilometers from the people's villages. But we walked back and forth all the time, and were sharing meals. I went hunting. I went gathering with people. It was sort of total immersion ethnography that very few anthropologists get to do anymore.
There's another question from Susan. How did you collect the story? Did you record them?
Yes, yep. And back then it was reel to reel. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And when the wind would blow, the tape would come off of the reel and you have to wind it back
You
up.
still have the reels?
I have the reels. They exist in a bookcase in my house, but I had them transformed first into cassettes and then put on disc. The people at UT Sound Lab did it for me.
You mentioned in the book that you had trouble with the reel to reel, but it never became clear to me how much you were able to salvage of your tapes.
Well, a huge amount, it turns out, because we're still transcribing and translating them after 50 years. So, you know, some of the quality is not very good. You know, wind is blowing and sand on the tapes, etc. But I have been able to start a group called the Juntois Transcription Group of native speakers who have learned to use computers, who have learned to use transcription software, and they are so quick at translating and transcribing their stuff. They didn't have a chance to have to become good English translators because the only schooling available to them was in Namibia anyway, in Afrikaans, up until the time of independence, which was 1990. So most of the transcribers that I trained are good transcribers translators into Afrikaans, but not in English. So the way we're working now is that we've set up a little office in a very, very remote part of northeastern Namibia, where we have computer stuff and we set up and paid for a Wi-Fi connection, tower and everything. And these guys work on the original sound files, which were transposed onto electronic media by the UT sound people, and they send me the transcriptions and their first stab at an English translation, and then I provide the smooth English translation from looking at their transcription, listening to the sound files, and seeing what they said in Afrikaans, which I can speak a little bit of.
Going back to the stories themselves,
Yes.
I was thinking when you mentioned animals and morals of Aesop's fables, I would be very interested in hearing just one. There were 4 sort of basic stories. Were they all similar or were they very different? And what did they say?
Well, one of the stories that I was most interested in was the story of the beautiful elephant girl. And beautiful elephant girl. Elephant girl. Yeah, she was actually this very protean heroine, appearing in many guises. Some of the time she was the lovely aardvark maiden, And some of the time she was the python girl, some of the times she was the beautiful elephant girl. But the story ranged across all kinds of strange adventures that she had trying to escape from her in-laws. Very, very interesting, and yeah, really, really dramatic stuff, you know, and from her husband making the mistake one day when he found an elephant in the camp instead of a girl who was his wife. He was betrayed by his younger brother, who said, look, it's just an elephant. You really should have a bite. It's really good meat, you know? And the older brother said, no, 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 it's my wife. I mean, she's not here, but the elephant's
Oh.
here. It must be she, etc. So there's all of this drama about the disguise that the wife goes into, because she's really deeply an elephant girl as well as a woman. And then many adventures while everybody discovers that, oh, there are elephants and there are wives, and you should keep them separate, you know. Don't go cooking and eating part of your own wife. Anyway, and you
Oh, I
know,
thought he was going to shoot the elephant, but he didn't. No, that was all right. It
No.
had a happy. On the
It was
whole,
a
are they
happy
sad stories or are they?
no, on the whole, they are rollickingly funny, bawdy, outrageous, and people are usually just like rolling on the ground, even though they've heard, and you know, they've heard the story so many
That
times.
probably makes it all the funnier.
It makes it all the funnier, and so that's where the excitement about having multiple storytellers comes in, because you
They can
can't
give it-
wait to say, what version are we going to hear now? What is this outrageous old lady going to say next? And
So that
It-
story that you told relates to a kind of universal happening that daughter,
Mm.
sons-in-law don't. On the whole, were they subjects and themes that we all would recognize, or are they some of them just totally different from anything we would know?
I would say about half and half. Some of them, yeah, obviously, but some of them are so arcane that it took me years and years and years to understand them. And most of the arcane ones have to do with the origin of the healing power that is awakened in the trance dance. And when I saw that so many of the stories were revolving around that mystery of that transformation, it was like a key to all the stories, you know. And then I realized, okay, what I'm really focusing on here is not just this marvelous panoply of stories, but the central metaphor that I believe now that holds the communities together. It is, we all collaborate in this beautiful dance, polyphonic singing by the women, beautiful intricate dancing by the men, and children and everyone participating. Awakening the healing power for laying on of hands is the central mystery that the people know holds them all together. So I think we're kind of getting a little low on time, so I'm thinking that
15 minutes.
15 minutes, but we need some more Q&A. What I'd like to do is, with your permission, if I've answered that enough, is go to the last quote that I have, which is it's a description of one of the many dances that I went to. Each dance, like each story, was different from each other dance and story. You never knew what was going to happen in a dance. There was just some magic that would be awakened by everyone collaborating to make this beautiful song and these beautiful physical dances happen. So I recorded music from maybe 50 dances in my 18 months there, and many in later years also. But I'd like to read you a description of one of the very special dances that I took part in. Most of the dances during those years were said to be giraffe dances. The giraffe dance had its own songs, all stemming from the original inspiration of a woman named Biesele, who received the first song while watching giraffes running in a thunderstorm. It was a medicine song, she said. Anybody with sense would know a medicine song when they heard one. There was a sense in which giraffe was seen as the classic healing dance of all the places it had traveled to and touched. In some ways, giraffe dances seemed to foreground the male dancers. Their precise steps were mesmerizing to watch. They did most of the active healing, and women only jumped up to dance briefly or to sprinkle the men with sang, which is aromatic powder, thought to have magical properties. They sprinkled this sang on the men to praise them, to praise their dancing. Every so often, a woman would rise up in an access of enthusiasm and dance a few delicate steps with the men, sometimes throwing this fragrant sang towards them from the tortoiseshell box hanging on a thong or a string of beads around her neck. But mostly the women sang and clapped joyously and resolutely to enable the men to dance. The men said often that the song could not rise to the sky, could not help the men's num, the magical healing power, to boil in their bodies unless the women sang it. The men encouraged the women by singing with them for a time and by praising them in turn, with the result that the women's voices came through louder and longer, more expertly ringing the changes on each cadence than I could have believed possible. And the foregrounding of men in the giraffe dance I sometimes thought I saw, it was dissolved out of existence over and over again by the ways the women, especially the older women, were clearly essential to the dance and were appreciated by all. One night, I saw a giraffe dance taken over completely by a young woman dancer. This dance was being held in a special clearing the community had made some way from their own village. Drooping ungwa trees, which is called in Southern Africa wild coffee, it's a bauhinia, made the spot into a secluded grove. The moon rose just as the dance began and soon was flickering through the branches overhead. Children ran about chasing each other, and some of them eventually started a fire in the center of the clearing. A few little girls plonked themselves down around the fire to clap and sing, drawing their raggedy skirts carefully between their legs for modesty. They looked toward where the adults were lounging on the sand, singing out in their high little voices and calling the adults to join them in the dance. Gradually, unhurriedly, casually sharing tobacco and matches and puffs from glowing pipes, women and a few men came to sit down with the children by their fire and began to sing softly. Over the next half hour or so, men sitting on the sand away from the fire shook out their dance rattles, long strings of braided fibers holding dried cocoons filled with pebbles or seeds or bits of broken ostrich eggshell, and tied them onto their legs. They fastened the strings just below their knees and above the bulges of their calf muscles, so that the rattles, descending and then ascending, caduceus-like on their strings, were secured. Then they rose one by one and, joking and calling to each other, came to the fire. A young woman at the dance shared the Juntra name that I had been given, Ba'u, and so we had a special relationship. Sometimes when I went to town, I brought her back some token of our name relationship, a scarf or some beads, and she in turn sewed a pretty diker skin bag for me and ornamented it with ostrich eggshell beads. This night, I noticed she was wearing a bright white sleeveless undershirt, so clean it must have just come out of its town wrappings. I chuckled inwardly, wondering if the new lover she had told me about had anything to do with her having a new undershirt. Ba'u sat in the circle of women around the fire, her legs intertwined with theirs, her head, like theirs, inclined to one side so she could hear the singing of her neighbor and join in the polyphony. Hours went by as the women sang with consummate skill. Bao's ramrod straight grandfather, taller than most Juntois men, was there, dancing as the women of his family and other families sang the giraffe songs. He didn't dance very long before he showed the familiar signs of approaching trance. Sweat appeared on his torso, he bent forward at the hips, and his eyes were focused on a middle distance that was elsewhere. There was absolutely no sign of fear or hesitation in his embrace of the transformation of consciousness. His was a commanding physical presence, and at first dominated the healing, but he shared its power immediately when other men fell into trance behind him in the circle. There was a heady sense in the air that anything could happen at any time, that one could do whatever one felt like doing. There was an atmosphere of complete equality. Old and young, men and women, the firm and the infirm were united in purpose and rhythm. Suddenly, Bao sprang up and began to dance in place. Her white undershirt flashed rhythmically one way and then the other in the light of the fire. Her dance was like no other dance I had seen at either the giraffe dance or any of the women's dances. It was entirely her own, entirely inspired, entirely of the moment. It took everyone's breath away. Bao had no spare meat on her body anywhere. She seemed in fighting trim to combat death. And indeed, she soon began to die in Pia, the name for the trance, which is related to the word Pi, to die. It's been called by colleagues of mine a half death or a partial death. All the while, she was continuing to dance her stunning, mesmerizing whole body dance. Sweat shone on her collarbone and her muscled brown chest above the neckline of the white undershirt. She trembled rhythmically and began to move around the circle of women, laying fluttering hands on each of them, caressing their babies' heads, then jumping back into her dance without losing a beat. She seemed to flare upward like an eternal flame. At one point, I saw her grandfather step back from the dance circle and watch her in what seemed complete concentration. Her action had been assertive, quite beyond what I had seen from women, especially young women of reproductive age, for many months of dances. I wondered if it had seemed as daring, as edgy to her grandfather and all her family as it seemed to me. I wondered especially whether it had been seen as a challenge to authority or had perhaps gone too far beyond the bounds of tradition. When the dance ended sometime later, Bao's grandfather was sitting at ease among his family at the watching fire, a little away from the dance circle. I went to join the group sitting around him. As Bao walked past, he spoke firmly but quietly to her. "Thank you for your dance, granddaughter," he said. "That was the most beautiful dance I have ever seen." So I'll stop there, and if you have questions, I would be so happy to take them. Yes.
I would love to know if there's a way to see one of these dances.
Yes, there are a few films that have been made, ethnographic films.
Are they on YouTube?
No, mostly the good ones are not. They are available through documentary educational resources in Massachusetts. But I have some of these on DVD, and we might be able to arrange something, arrange a showing. Yeah.
I sense a part 2 coming.
Sequel.
Sequel, yes.
As long as somebody else like this fine gentleman here deals with the tech of it, I'll be there. Yes.
I have a question. Earlier you mentioned that your tent camp was not in the village. I was wondering why that was the case, because I know most of my Peace Corps friends, when they were in the Peace Corps, their tents were in the villages.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was a combination of factors. For one thing, I was there on my own, and I felt quite keenly the impossibility of having a quiet moment to myself if I was living right in the village. It would have been a 24-hour-a-day festival of talking and busyness and noise. And I'm sort of an introvert. I need some quiet time. It was partly that, but partly because I felt like I didn't want to intrude. I wanted to be there. I wanted to learn. And if the people invited me to come and stay with them, that would be great. But they thought it was very normal for me to have their own, have my own camp. And they were very, very happy to help me build it. It was the beginning of our building of trust. I employed people to build me a really, really beautiful thatched house. There's a picture of it in here, and paid them for it and fed them while they were working. And so we came to trust each other in that way. But it was also that I wanted to be someplace that was close enough to a road that I could get on the road and on my way to the clinic if necessary. It was considerations like that also. Tom,
Briefly, because I have to leave.
oh, okay.
No, the breadth of their language, did they have much wide vocabulary? In other words, you talk about the unwritten language, which I, of course, can't conceive of, nor can I have this mental pictures of hunters and gatherers. But the vastness of their vocabulary, their ability to communicate, can you elaborate on what they had?
Well, there's a couple of answers to that. One is that linguists say that that with languages, it really doesn't matter how many words you have, because you work with the words that you've got and get the meanings across that are needed in the community and in daily life. But it's also true that we are just at the beginning of knowing how many vocabulary words are in this language, because it has to all be done orally by actually someone like myself who's had enough experience to know when she's hearing a new word for the first time. So the first dictionary of this language was done by the linguist Patrick Dickens, with whom I worked in later years, not in those first years of fieldwork. And that first dictionary contains about 4,000 words, but we are discovering new words every day with the transcription group, and we're now able to email each other many times a day saying, well, what's the definition of this word? Never heard this one before. And what's great is I now get back not only a definition, but the precise spelling. I mean, they're much better spellers in their new language than I am. And also all kinds of metadata about metaphoric references and the respect word for this and that, and how plants are used. It's encyclopedic. And so we're really just at the beginning, and this dictionary needs to be expanded greatly already. I know you have to go. Kay, thank you so much for being here. Great.
So you said you paid them. What did you pay them in?
Food and money. Yeah,
Money?
yeah.
So they go into cities and spend it, or what do they do with the money?
No, they would, there weren't any cities nearby, and even the towns were incredibly sort of primitive outposts. You were lucky if there was a Portuguese or Indian trader who had sometimes completely nothing on the shelves, very, very iffy what might be on the shelf, one can of beans or, that kind of thing. But they also could use money in a limited way with the neighboring pastoralists who had cattle. and they could get milk and meat
Okay.
that way. But in general, they appreciated the food more than the money because there weren't very many places to spend money there. So it was an exchange of, probably really, really uneven, but the best that I could work out was to keep the food supply coming for the storytellers, and they gave me these inestimable gifts.
What was their typical
language.
diet?
Oh, it was very exciting because the people were still hunting and gathering, and I got a chance to go on some of these expeditions. We had warthog, one of the most delicious lean pork that you have ever tasted. Kudu, eland, Cape buffalo. And we had smaller things like guinea fowls, spring hare. It was a panoply of plenty, but few and far between, so everyone was pretty much on the edge of hunger all the time, but there was lots potentially out there to eat. And as far as the gathered foods, there was everything from nuts and berries to big mushrooms in the rainy season. There was a salady kind of plant, which was my absolute favorite. It was a succulent, but tasted like a green salad. So we never knew what there was going to be to eat on any day, get up, the great excitement. I also brought, sort of camping food that I could trade for, say, a freshly shot guinea fowl, that kind of thing. And when I had the older people, storytellers, staying at my camp for a week at a time, then we would put everything together in a big pot over the fire, and I would have beans or canned squash or mealy meal, cornmeal or something like that to put in, rice, onions really, really greatly treasured out there. And they would have this, marvelous fresh food to put in.
Were any of the animals or birds off limits, like regarded as, like the elephant, perhaps sacred in some way?
Yeah, sacred and also too dangerous to eat.
Oh,
But dangerous in a mystical way, not so much that, well, okay, probably the most dangerous animal they hunted was Cape buffalo, but that's
well, that's
really
pretty dangerous.
dangerous
Yeah.
animal. But everybody could eat one if you brought one down. But ostriches, which are a little easier to get, were considered very, very, very dangerous, and only the old people could eat ostrich. Young people, it supposedly made them go mad. So my interpretation of this has been, and I haven't proved it or anything, that this was a way to distribute the protein, make sure the old folks actually got the ostrich, to eat. But with an elaborate system of explanations of why people of certain ages, or people who had not yet born children, or people who had only had 2 children but not 3 children, could eat certain things. And so it was like a huge distribution scheme about that. So they were not really considered holy, but people had this whole scheme in their heads about who could eat what,
What about elephants? Did they eat elephants?
At the beginning of my time there, they did not eat elephant because they said the flesh was too much like human flesh. And that's
Oh.
referred to in that story, of course.
Yes,
Makes you wonder how they know that.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's a horrible question.
But in later decades, when I was in Namibia, started out in Botswana, when I was in Namibia, there were safari hunters who were killing a lot of elephants. And in fact, there was a plague, almost a plague of elephants that came into the area looking for water, and were creating a lot of trouble and danger for the people. So the safari people were killing elephants, and they were giving away the free meat. And so people started eating it at that time because, well, it's a complicated situation. The South African Defense Forces, the Army, that was active before independence in 1990, had killed off most of the available smaller game. And so the elephants were predominant and people were really hungry, so they started eating elephant at that time, but they weren't happy about it, you know, because they had all this stuff in their heads about the magic qualities of the elephant hero, and then
Could be your wife.
could be why, yeah, look out.
Living off by yourself like you were, did you have encounters at night, animals coming into your area? Were you
Um,
threatened at all?
No, I always had people around me. I didn't, and that I should tell you that camp that I had, that was a couple kilometers away. I had brought people with me, people with me from the Harvard camp, and they lived with me in my camp. So that made the visiting back and forth, and the translating very easy. Yeah.
Are there young scholars?
Question,
Sorry,
Yes,
Sorry, Joanna.
do you or anybody else develop a written language for them?
Yes, yes, and I'm so happy to say that I was able to be part of that. I'm not a linguist, but in later years, the Kalahari People's Fund, which is the 501c3 organization that I and my colleagues started together, we hired a linguist from South Africa to come and put together a grammar of the language and eventually the dictionary that I was speaking of. And my contribution was as a person who had a pretty good vocabulary. And so I worked very closely with him. His name is Patrick Dickens. But that was 20 years. That happened 20 years after I was first there. So I was using very impressionistic ways to write the language, and each one of my colleagues wrote it in a different way, and it was, you know, certainly not making a searchable database out of that. But 20 years later, this wonderful linguist developed an orthography, which is a way of writing that could be done on any keyboard, and taught it to people, and it was eventually accepted by the Namibian government as the official orthography of their language.
And did you Indigenous people use the written language or just scholars?
Yes, they have very excited. Well, we had to start a school system also in that language. There's a long story, long story.
Man, I would like to go on, but they want their room back here.
Oh,
The
no.
bank is.
Oh, dear. Can we have one last question?
Yes.
It seems to be a burning question.
Yeah, I was very interested in the ethical that you had in pumping people for information about their lives and their language, and in paying people for things and not paying people for other things and so forth, because that related to experiences I have. Because I was an out and out employer of African people, not Klick people, and they would not let me learn their language. And I had about 8 languages in my camp. And every time I'd learn a word in one language and come back to it, they'd give me 8 different words for the same thing. There was a deliberate campaign. They did not want the Wana understanding what they said. And the other thing was they had it was clear one Sunday when I went down that they had a very intricate magic religious ceremony going on the night before. And you know, as I told you, I got a long way towards a degree in anthropology, so I was intrigued by this, and I begged them to let me come to the next ceremony they had. And that was very quickly. And then I had an anthropologist friend in nearby who was studying the detribalization of people that were coming in from the bush like this and whatnot. She actually lived in the camp. And she had some ethical problems too, because in those days in Zambia, people were still killing twins at birth and killing albinos at birth. And a couple of those events.
May I stop you just for a moment? Some people needing to leave. I wanted to tell you that I have a few copies of the book for sale in the back there.
Once upon a time is
Much of the book,
now, once upon a time is
how
now.
much of the books?
They're 1999.
And it's really well written.
That's the advantage of being an English major and an anthropology
Oh.
major. You were able to, but
And the,
They're in the back.
the benefits go to the Kalahari's People Fund.
yeah, which I didn't have a chance to tell you about, but it's one of the only advocacy organizations of scholars that I know of for an indigenous people. Anyway,
Thank you. Wonderful.
thank you so much for having me here. Oh, and there's some postcards also. Yeah, that's the book.
No, I don't.